Hello and welcome back to the PSC In Conversation. We have a very special episode as part of our Next 20 series. Very special for two reasons. One, we have a live studio audience. Very good. Yeah. First time. And we also have a brilliant guest today in the form of Vikie Bew. Vikie, I realised that we first met 10 years ago, which is the perfect halfway point in the 20-year existence of the PSC. So at some point I will ask you about reflections of that. But Vikie had a storied career prior to the world of AI, working in the Financial Conduct Authority, then 2020 Delivery, then Nesta, then you were at the Treasury, right?
That's right.
And then you had, no, I know this, 4 brilliant years at 2020. Please tell me I got
That's
that right.
That's correct, yeah.
A few good. Well, maybe we could talk about some excellent projects. But most recently, you have just left a very fascinating role as Deputy Director for the Incubator for Artificial Intelligence of the UK government. So Vikie, welcome.
Thank you.
It's very, very, very special to have you here. Maybe if we start off with the first question, what is the Incubator for Art? What's it trying to do, and what problem is it trying to solve, or challenge is it trying to address? And then I'll ask you about some, where are AI and public services now?
Great. Well, firstly, thank you for having me, Tony. It's so nice to chat with you and catch up. I.AI, the Incubator for Artificial Intelligence, was founded 3 years ago, which blows my mind, because a lot has changed in 3 years, but also our mission remains constant. The team was founded, if I take you back to what was happening sort of back then, it was founded just around the time of the Bletchley Summit. So this is when then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was really keen to lay a stake in the ground about AI safety. So a lot of very prominent academics were advising the government about the importance of doing groundbreaking research about protecting citizens, consumers, and I suppose the global economy from the risks associated with AI gone wrong. So he hosted the Bletchley Summit, the first AI summit that the world had, which was at Bletchley Park in the UK, and also announced the creation of the AC, which is the AI Safety Institute, now called AI Security Institute. And that was sort of all a big package of investing in safety and really making sure that world-class researchers, many of whom were from the UK, can help protect against these sort of existential risks. That is incredibly important and something that I'm glad that the UK is investing in, but is not the focus of I.AI. The reason why I'm explaining that background is because we were created as a bit of a counterbalance to that narrative. And the idea being that you don't want to just invest in protecting people against the risks associated with AI. You also need to harness the opportunities. And I.AI is really about that kind of opportunity space. So the team is a technical team in the heart of UK government, really focused on building out AI products for the public good. So thinking about use cases where AI can make things better for citizens, make back offices work more smoothly, or just novel ideas that we want to try out in a safe space. And we need technologists in government to be able to do that. And it's all about that sort of opportunities, ideation, innovation, and ultimately about impact.
Wow, thank you. And maybe just for as a little hook back, so we're recording at a time when Claude from Anthropic, their new model, Mythos, is doing all the rounds about its unusually sophisticated capabilities, particularly from a cyber vulnerabilities detection point, which could be used by bad actors. And I think it's fair to say that the AI Security Institute is probably leading the way globally in helping address those challenges. But so that is fascinating to hear that there was the counterbalance there with the existence of the incubator. And that brings us maybe to the first question, which is, so governments across the world are all, I think, almost universally asking the question, AI, they're not asking the question good or bad, but I won't ask you that. How do we use it to improve public services? And one of the interesting challenges is, what does that even mean at the next level down? Is it we're trying to do something really innovative? So for instance, in Albania, they have their virtual AI minister who is actually a virtual AI thing. Or you have something like the incubator, which I think it would probably be fair to say is much more focused on practical tools that civil servants could use. with the vantage point now of a little bit of time reflecting, do you have a sense of where governments should be focusing on? Should they be going for that innovative side that only governments can do, or should they be focusing on, let's use proven tools which we can roll out quickly?
It's a brilliant question, and I think a bit of a trick question.
Oh,
The
right.
answer
Okay.
is both. In my view, impact is the mandate. So that is what we come to work for. If you're a civil servant, hopefully that's what gets you out of bed in the morning. It's about making public services better. And that really has to be sort of where you're focusing all of your energies. But with novel technologies, or indeed any kind of transformation program, we might talk a bit about that later, because there's a lot of things which aren't just about the technology that go into making public services better with AI. But with novel technology deployment, you need to make sure that you're innovating and doing that in a safe kind of sandbox style environment, because we don't yet know exactly what the technology can do in all instances. We don't yet know the best ways to deploy it in public services. We don't yet know sort of where the cracks might be in user journeys or users' ability to interface with the technology. And therefore, I think it's really important that you have these kind of ring-fence teams that can try things before you then roll them out at scale. So in your question, kind of innovation or impact, it has to be both, and it's innovation for impact. And that's, I think, the way that you deliver real change. In the incubator, we did quite a lot of this. So we focused on trying ideas really quickly, failing our projects fast if they weren't working, but then taking the sort of ideas that worked really well and rising to them to the top so that you can then deploy them much more widely, which is happening with some of the so-called Humphrey Toolkit, which you can see on the website if you want to have a look on ai.gov.uk. But it talks about some of the tooling like Consult or Lex, which I can talk about a little bit if you're interested, or folks can have a look. Could you give us a flavour of
like the range of tools? Because there's about a dozen, and presumably some never saw beyond discovery phase.
Exactly. There's many, many more that were beyond sort of stuck in discovery phase. Stuck's not the right word.
No.
There are many tools that we kept in discovery phase and didn't promote through to alpha and beyond. In the first year, there were 50 of those. So we really did kind of work on quite a lot of projects. Some things also won't be appropriate for conversation with the public domains. There is work that we're doing kind of behind the scenes in public services that we wouldn't necessarily want to put on the website, which you would expect to be happening, but it's yes, not something we want to shout about. In terms of the tooling that we can talk about, so Consult, I think, is a really good retail example. And it's also something that AI is very good at. So hopefully most people who are listening to the podcast know that sort of AI in its current flavour is often talking about large language models. So this is your kind of ChatGPTs, your Claudes, your Geminis that folks might use on a day-to-day basis. Those models are very, very good at dissecting large amounts of text and summarising it, or capturing themes so that you can make use of that information in a more easy to read format. Public consultations are a problem that is perfectly shaped for this sort of technology. So whenever you want to make legislation in the UK or do a very significant change in sort of public services, you have to consult with the public, and that is right and proper and what you should do. But it's very, very lengthy to do that, and you often receive enormous amounts of responses to those consultations, many of which are often not written by a human in today's world, and might in fact be written by AI, or we've got examples of bots sending in responses to consultations. So one of the things that we were doing to try and make public services adopt faster policies and speed up that process from consultation kickoff to policy implementation was using an AI tool which we built called Consult to help you summarise those responses, pull out key themes, and then move, I suppose, from idea to action much more quickly. What our research found is that the tool was just as accurate as human reviewers, in some cases more accurate, which is interesting, sort of when we did blind studies and got reviewers to side-by-side review responses. So in pulling out the themes, the tool was more accurate or just as accurate as human reviewers, but 400 times faster than human reviewers. So it really does do that job much more quickly. I mean, the policymakers could not spend their time reading lots of documents, but instead thinking about the ideas coming out of the documents.
So how, maybe I'll ask you as an individual rather than as the incubator, but those are some fairly, and I remember reading the research reports, some pretty well-evidenced stats which say this is quicker and faster and cheaper than a human operator. But obviously not all government departments or all public services are using Consult or any other AI tool. Like what is how should governments feel about a lack of desire to adopt by public services?
It's an interesting question. And we should get on to lack of desire, but I also think there are other barriers preventing adoption. So in many cases, actually, technical access is an issue. So not all governments operate on the same technical systems. It's not necessarily the case that all civil servants would be able to use these tools, even if they were made available. So that can be a barrier, and it's something that I think public services should look to fix, which we could get onto later if we wanted to, because it's about that sort of backbone that sits underneath the innovation and the transformation projects. But getting to your question, one of the barriers I think that prevents civil servants from wanting to adopt these tools is fear about the tool not doing a job as well as they could do it, or fear about changing the process. And that can come from many different places. Sometimes that comes from a lack of knowledge about the tooling or understanding quite how it works. It might come from a lack of time to invest in learning how to use the tooling. It might also come from very valid concerns about the tool itself and not having been involved in the design process. So I think that when you're thinking about deploying AI into public services, you really need to spend a lot of time working with those expert civil servants to co-design the tooling and co-design your products so that it will at least operate within their current workflow, and at best work with them to redesign the flow in a way that they would want it to work better.
So can I ask the trade-off there? So the Secretary of State has said, the UK wants to be the fastest adopter of AI in the G7. And when you look across the world, so UAE and India are prime examples of probably faster adoption of AI tools within government services. And one of the big levers there is mandating use. And I think you're saying, and this is something we touched upon in a podcast earlier in the series about our work on the schools buying project at the DFE. Is your belief, therefore, that it's the job of good technology for government to be designed so well that people choose to use it, and you shouldn't go down the mandation route, or should mandation be something in your armory?
A great question. I think the barrier, the bar to mandating has to be high. If you're mandating a technology, it needs to be proven that it works. You also need to have a team that will confirm sort of no downtime in the technology and make sure that it will always be ready and available. That absolutely can be an operating model that works well, but is not necessarily desirable for all AI products. I think this sort of speaks to a wider point about terminology, where I know that many people, both in the private sector and the public sector, are desperate to realize the benefits of AI, but don't necessarily segment the different types of AI or the different types of benefits that they want to realize. And I think doing that segmentation exercise is how you'll then get into areas that might be easier to mandate, or tooling that might be more ready to go, such as kind of centralized productivity tooling. Like you might not need people writing detailed minutes of meetings anymore, for example, and could use off-the-shelf tooling for that. Versus areas that are much more bespoke, need much more hand-holding, and the prize is arguably more exciting and bigger because it's about redesign of services. But also the cost is larger because you need to spend that time bringing people on the journey and teaching them how to engage with the tool. But I'd be interested in your perspective on this, because you work with civil servants and public servants all the time. What do you think?
So this is a personal view, not necessarily the house view. The personal view is like I agree. The onus should be on designing something so good that there is a preference for using it. But I mean, we as 2020 delivery worked in the government digital service, 10, 11, 12 years ago now. And it is undoubtedly true, or I would strongly stand by the fact it's undoubtedly true, that one of the quickest ways to save money and deliver a step change improvement is to stop people doing things and to force them to do something else. And spend controls was a very blunt instrument for doing that with a lot of technology, and it had many negative consequences, but it saved a lot of money and it stopped people making a lot of mistakes. So I don't think used judiciously, mandation, I think, can be really valuable.
And do you think we're ready for it?
Well, I think that then comes to a very good question about, maturity. Like, what do you mean by AI and maturity within differential tools? And I think for certain low risk, high volume tasks, I think we are. I think summarization is a good example. But there's actually, in public services, I think one thing that we talk about in a different episode is the risk calculus is different because they have to be universal. The lens is a lot stronger. And so if you get something wrong, we hold technology up and we hold public services up to a much higher standard than anyone does in the private sector. And so I don't think we are quite ready yet from a, I guess, environmental, societal point of view of expectations.
I think that raises an important point about the public as well and their expectations. It's something we encountered quite a lot, even with tools like Consult, which to most civil servants seem like a no-brainer, something, a no-regrets move.
Yeah.
But if you speak to your average member of the public, they might be quite shocked to find out how consultations are currently managed and that it's not the minister reading their individual response. And if you push it even further and think about an AI trawling the response, even though I wouldn't use that language, but they might, they wouldn't be happy with that at all. So you do also need to think about sort of, it's not just risk tolerance and accuracy, but also trust and public support.
So, well, actually, you've given me a red rag there. Can you tell me about trust? So I wonder if trust, I know it's a big focus and it's a big word, but it strikes me that trust is a slightly problematic term because it's slippery. Like, you can't say. So the example I gave recently at a talk was. I was back at my old in my old university giving a talk on AI, and I remember I was in the college I was at 20 years ago. When I was at 20 plus years ago, you had to pay for your tuition fees, and I remember being given the option to pay online, and I would have never in a million years back then doing it. I remember having the argument with my parents, and everything was done by check because people just didn't trust the system. There's no kite mark, there's no certification, there's no like third-party verification system that could have convinced me or most people otherwise. So then that begs the question, like, is trust a useful focus to be optimizing for when actually most new technologies aren't delivered by mandating trust, as it were?
I entirely agree you can't mandate trust, but I think just because it's difficult to achieve doesn't mean that it shouldn't be the goal. One of the ways that we were thinking about this in the Incubator was through evaluations. So we had a dedicated impact evaluation team who would be running RCTs wherever possible, but other kind of evaluation methods to assess like for like the impact of our tooling versus the kind of current counterfactual or the next best alternative. And that is one way that you can help kind of build a bit of trust. But as you say, a lot of it is not scientific. It's a feeling rather than a like reading a report or seeing a statistic. And I think this is where it comes down to sort of the journey that you might want to take with citizens and choosing some high reward, low risk use cases, which can then start to change the dialogue a little bit about how AI can be used for public benefit. I think it's a really good example if you think about issues like healthcare. So the prize is obviously enormous in healthcare, and there's obviously a lot of issues that you might want to try and fix in terms of kind of optimization or diagnostics. But the risks are also enormous. If it's somebody's health, you wouldn't want that to go wrong. And within a hospital, there's little room for error because they often are kind of under resourced already and have their challenges in their operating model. But there are other parts of public services that don't feel so emotive and maybe aren't quite so high risk. And I might give planning as an example there, which is something that we were working on with colleagues at Number 10 from the Incubator. This is about making sure that you can have this is about being able to build as many houses or develop areas of kind of urban landscape as possible. But currently there are lots of paperwork-based barriers to getting a development over the line, even if you have the money and the motivation to do so.
Well, I've got one more big question, and then we have a fantastic audience, very good-looking audience as well. So we will be asking for some questions from you imminently. But before that, I have micro question than a macro one. The micro one is, I thought I was being helpful, and I would love your reflections. So the Incubator retired or deprecated a series of tools, and we used to, when we were at the Government Digital Service, there were a series of tools, one of which was the Platform as a Service, PaaS, which ended up being deprecated. And the idea was, like, back then, that government would create its own way of cloud hosting. In fact, it was a wrapper around other cloud hosting providers, but it was government doing something, and they retired it on the basis that the market, the private sector, had effectively matured to a point where it could provide something just as good, cheap as safe. And people used to say, "Oh, that's really sad that the government's failing." And I thought, no, that's a mature government that shows that it's engaging with the private sector and the ecosystem, and that's a sign of success, not to be poo-pooed. And I remember saying that to lots of people who, I'm sure you heard, when they were sort of almost gleeful that the Incubator had decided that certain things could be retired. Is that how do you feel about that? Is the right way to think about it?
Well, I mean, it's a huge question on the role of the state, isn't it? And do you want a big state, little state, in-betweeny state? I think you're talking about Red Box potentially, and there are some other examples that we sunsetted. And I think my kind of emotional journey is maybe similar to the one you described, that I personally feel quite sad that Red Box didn't get to realise the vision that I was hoping it would. For those who don't know, Redbox was a chat interface for civil servants, which we developed before most civil servants had access to Gemini or ChatGPT or any of the other enterprise solutions. So it allowed civil servants to ask kind of generalized queries, upload documents, do so in a secure environment, but also toggle between the different providers. So you could choose which model you wanted to use for different tasks. I think it was brilliant. But it's also not necessarily long-term viable to build, maintain, and improve such tooling over time. So I think you're right. I think in terms of kind of cost effectiveness, in terms of making best use of suppliers who want to work with the state, want to amplify their impact by helping make public services better, we need to be a smart contractor of services from tech companies and not just build them by ourselves. I think this does, though, put the onus on kind of contracting, procurement, and lots of the more sort of back office parts of technology, rather than the sort of technology build itself, to make sure that you are getting a good deal for users, that you're able to port across your data to different providers if you want to, and all of those sort of good things to make sure the system works well.
Very good, thank you. Okay, so big question. Let's try and port your experience from the UK. Let's assume there's a new government somewhere in the world. I mean, we just had elections in Hungary, but I'm sure there are other elections due imminently. And then they're picking up the phone and they're saying, "Vikie, what should AI ? How do we do it in government? What would you say? Where should leaders start?"
Step one is to hire some technologists. If they don't already have them, they need people who live and breathe this technology in-house. Ideally, you would hire them permanently to be civil servants and not sort of on secondment from technology companies. I think that's one of the best ways to get kind of that advisory function up and running. Step two is probably to make sure that your infrastructure is in place. So if you don't have cloud platforming, if you don't have the right technology to be able to build things, some compute, then you won't be able to get very far. So you need to sort of put that in motion. And then step three is really about the ideas. So you want some AI, that sounds brilliant, but what do you want to use it for? What's your vision? Is this about efficiencies and cutting out cost? Is this about novel ways of interacting with citizens, and it's really about their engagement with the state? Or is it something different and about reimagining the way public services work? And then you build your program around that, but being really clear on the vision is obviously core.
And if you didn't quite catch all of that, Vicky's short answer was hire the PSC.
Exactly.
But no, thank you. That is a brilliant answer. And actually, I will have the prerogative to ask one final question before opening to the audience, which I'd be remiss not to do, is reflecting back on your time at 2020 Delivery. Wasn't I great fun? No. What helped you during that time, which has been beneficial during your time in government?
I think, so you were great fun.
So we could cut that.
We can cover that later. So I think the most important skill I learned from my time at the PSC was about the delivery discipline. So it's all well and good having a brilliant idea about how to make public services better. Lots of people have brilliant ideas. But actually, if you want to deliver impact, it's about having a plan and moving that idea forwards, getting the right people around the table, having some milestones, forcing things to happen so that you create momentum. And I think that's a skill which the civil service doesn't always have in droves, and sometimes doesn't need to, but is really critical for making things happen.
All right, Vikie, thank you. Let's open up to the audience. Who has a question? Maybe shout it out, and I'll repeat it because we couldn't afford a roving mic. Thank you. So, Eleanor, for just repeating for the audio. So, the question was: when designing a new or discovering a new tool, would you design for current preferences or for a future optimal, better state? Is that fair?
What a great question. And there's sort of the difference between what happens in reality, I think, and maybe what should happen. And then the art is kind of moving from one state to the other nimbly, if possible. So in practice, in my experience, we often are so pushed on timeframes when working in civil service. Ministers want you to deliver something very quickly. And also you're working on a very pressing issue that you don't want to let slide. And that means that you end up trying to optimize the current state of affairs, adding some technology or better processes into the mix to make things run smoother, maybe be faster, maybe be cheaper. And that is obviously a good thing to do and noble. But the bigger prize is in reimagining the service and reimagining the workflow. That, however, will take you longer and be more difficult to do, because if it was easy, we would probably already be thinking of it that way. It might require people to have different jobs or work in different ways, or new organizations to prop up in different guises. So if you're thinking about kind of how would we go about this, within the Incubator, we really worked as a bit of a sort of internal consultancy. So working alongside, I suppose in that guise you call them clients in other government departments, to then build trusted relationships over time so that you can start to not just talk to them about optimizing their current workflow, but actually what's on the horizon, what are the big issues that you've been thinking about for years and have never got to, and then start to add some of those ideas into your technology. I think this is where having technologists sort of forward deployed is the language that people love to use now, but your sort of forward deployed engineers on the team is so important, because they can then be in the conversation with those policymakers and start to tinker in the background, maybe vibe code up a quick solution, show it in real time, and then from there an idea can brew. But Antonio, what about you? I would love to know your perspectives on this issue in your kind of client work and beyond.
Well, I suspect it comes back to what are you optimizing for. We will sometimes say to clients, like, if you actually just want to say I've done a shiny new AI thing because you need to show to the world that you're progressive or with the technology you want to improve, unfortunately, I think you do need to make the trade-off and to kind of enhance the current state with some improvements which are focused on value for the public, but maybe don't fully redesign. That is not optimal. That's not what you should focus on. But actually, as we know about delivery is also a momentum game and a confidence game. So getting some quick wins helps. But the ideal should always be redesign the true problem. And almost certainly the true problem will be enhanced by AI, but it won't be solved by it. And it'll force you to change things for the better, which may end up with a much smaller technological solution, which is probably a better thing in the world because it incurs less debt and risk. Great question. So will AI widen inequity and inequalities in access? And if so, what and can and should governments do about it? Easy. For you, Vikie, please.
Thank you. For me, brilliant. I think, will AI widen inequities? Probably. With any new sort of technology or transformation, there will be areas of public service delivery where it won't be spread evenly. But I think I would argue that that's not down to AI or the technology. It's mainly down to funding, resourcing, and bandwidth of management to be able to adopt new ways of working. There are some examples of AI in sort of hospital settings that are going to be quite risky and difficult to implement, and therefore it should probably only be the more well-resourced organizations that take that on, unless you have kind of centralized resource to help others go on that journey. Because what you don't want to do is be going on your innovation journey and letting patients kind of slip behind. So that might be the case in the first instance. I think, though, the muscle which you need to build, which is true in many areas of transforming the state, not just AI, is taking what we know works and then deploying it at scale, providing the resources to do so, and rolling it out. There's a question about whether previous tech debt will prevent adoption. So if you don't have a good electronic patient record, does that mean that you can't use AI? And I think the answer is in some instances yes, and in some instances no. It depends what you're using AI for. There are many examples of things that might not need to dock into that platform. So say, for example, caregivers or clinicians using voice dictation software to take notes. That sort of thing doesn't necessarily need to dock into a wider platform and could be quite cheap to operate. But there are other sort of bigger prizes in terms of diagnostics or patient flow optimization where you would almost certainly need to dock it in. What do you think, Antonio, on the big question?
I would say that AI per se doesn't widen the inequities. It's the opportunity cost which might. So if you take your eye off the ball, so you don't do your cloud replatforming, you don't do your proper cybersecurity checks and your vulnerabilities, you don't upskill your workforce in the basics of proper data entry and data schematics and data standards, at the expense of a big AI push, then I think that's when you'll get the big problems. And I completely agree, Vicky. One of the bits that's, I think, misunderstood about the new generation of LLMs is often they are entirely not dependent on pre-existing data sets. Actually, if you try and mess about a good example of this is we used in the early days, actually, even before it was cool, some LLM software for bid writing. And I remember when it was trained on some of our data, it was imperceptibly different, and actually was slightly worse than if it was just trained on kind of its open data sets. And that's got slightly better over time, but actually, as you say, a lot of this stuff doesn't need a pre-existing data set to be able to work well. Let's take 3 more questions. Shall I go first? So how can AI in 2026 be a catalyst for a more equitable society? Making the case for it, and I'll filibuster, Vicky, whilst you can have a go. So I would say 3 points to that. The first is that the case for change is as great as it's ever been. So on a purely demand versus supply basis, demand, when you see it in courts backlogs, you see it in the 7 million NHS backlog, you see it in almost all elements of public services, demand is outstripping the current levels of supply. So something has to change. The second point is not all generations in history are blessed with general purpose technologies which have the ability to materially improve kind of human well-being. And for good or ill, AI is the thing that we have. And I whatever it is, probably if you count from 2012, some sort of 14 years into this LLM-focused transformer generation of tech, it is pretty unarguable that this is a big deal. Okay, so this presents a big opportunity. So then the question is, well, you have a challenge, you have an enormously high potential technology. You have a responsibility to find a way to make this work and make this work well. The difficulty is that you have to do that whilst fixing all the other things which still need addressing. And I think you need to not take your eye off that and assume that it will solve everything. But it is, we have a duty to try and make things better with the tools we have at our disposal.
I think use case identification is really critical here. There are many parts of public services that are incredibly complex and arguably not working very well, that are mainly used or only used by those on lower incomes or who have comorbidities or complex needs. And so you could quite easily target a series of AI interventions at that segment of the population. I think the challenge, though, will be in mitigating the risks associated with that, because with those groups come more kind of complex demands in terms of making sure that the tools are accurate, easy to understand, that folks have the digital infrastructure at home to be able to access the tools. So not everybody has a smartphone and so on. But we do know that paperwork burden is enormous for engaging with the state. There's lots of statistics that go around about how much of our time is wasted based on paperwork for the state for sort of every citizen. But if you're claiming benefits or have complex arrangements, that's even higher. And so the prize is arguably much bigger for those populations. It is just about putting in the time and effort to make sure that the AI interventions or any transformation is kind of well designed to meet their needs.
Okay, I think final two questions. So beyond technologists, what's needed to make AI work?
So, I mean, first, within the technologist bracket, there's a number of different jobs, and not all technologists are equal. You've got your AI engineers, you've got your user researchers and designers, you'll have product managers who help to make sure that everything is working smoothly. So you do need sort of that full suite of technologists. But beyond technologists, I think the main discipline that you need is transformation, change managers, delivery managers. Actually, it's really close to the skill set of folks like the PSC and the sort of thing that I used to do when I worked here, because it's about setting out that delivery plan, trying to bring all of your stakeholders on the journey, make sure that the technologists aren't just going into a hole and building the most beautiful thing that they would be very proud of in their sort of PhD thesis, but it's actually embedded into the real world. And there's some timelines to kind of force it to get out there. So I think the biggest kind of group of non-technologist roles is in that sort of delivery and consulting sort of suite.
Thank you. Russell, final question.
Are there use cases that you've got sort of top of mind that you think the government should be progressing for AI that it's not? And if there are some, why isn't it?
That is an absolutely brilliant question. And I think if you asked me sort of a year and a half ago, I definitely would. There were loads of use cases that I was quite frustrated that weren't being sort of picked up. But the reality of the situation is that now many people across public services are sort of on the AI bandwagon, and it's not just teams like the Incubator that are building out AI for public good, which means that I think most areas of public service do have people thinking about how to use AI within their workflows. The question, however, is kind of, is it going fast enough, and are we seeing that transformational change quick enough? And I think sort of one area where the UK is slightly behind, although there's lots of work in progress, some other nations, is in that sort of citizen interface. So you've got sort of other countries, Ukraine is an example for various reasons, where AI is helping citizens interface with the state on a daily basis. That's not yet the lived reality of people in this country, but something that I think would change the dial and help sort of build trust in AI being used for good, but also build trust in the state by helping people get the services they need quickly, not have to fill in loads of forms, and not have to spend lots of time engaging for services that they think that they should be getting already.
Vikie, we're nearly at time. Do you have any final reflections, things you'd like to share that we haven't covered yet?
Gosh, I think just that the world of AI is changing rapidly, but what isn't necessarily changing is the kind of core discipline of getting things done in public services. So whilst we can all get very excited about the latest model release and the sort of snazzy things that can go on that each of the sort of technology companies is throwing at us, and it is very exciting, actually at the core is kind of the good discipline of trying to know the problem you're going to solve, knowing who you want to do it with, what are your deadlines, how are you going to get there, and that's how you make change happen. That's how you deploy AI for the public good, but that's just more broadly how to impact public services for the better.
Thank you for saying that, Vikie. That's heartening and I think spot on. Those critical skills still remain in the age of AI. Maybe if I can say the final bit, which is, I'll get on a soapbox, which is, it strikes me that there is, I mean, I think Britain has had this for a very long time, but a lot of soul searching about Britain's role in the world, and particularly how, you know, we're maybe, there's a narrative that Britain is a passenger in the AI revolution. And I think that is deeply unfair. And actually, the UK has played an enormous role, from Turing to Geoffrey Hinton to Demis Hassabis, from the work in Cambridge to UCL, from the work of great startups, of which Google DeepMind is obviously one, but many, many spin-outs in the UK. Actually, Britain has played a huge role in AI. And actually, on the government and public services side, I think the AI Security Institute, as you said, is a true beacon globally. And the Incubator is a brilliant example and has been a real role model for nations worldwide about how do you identify valuable use cases for public services. And we're very proud that you've played such a brilliant role in that. We are proud of all our alumni at the PSC, but it's very special to be able to share this conversation with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. And what a great training ground for going on and building good things in public services. I wouldn't be there without working with you all on these big topics.
Vikie Bew, this has been your life. This has been the PSC in Conversation, the part of the Next 20 series. Thank you so much for joining us. And stay tuned for the next episode in the series soon.